And of course, a diesel sub is something that it's a wonderful device, but sooner or later, you know, you're going to have to get the heck out of there, and that's what he did. So he moves away from the Japanese task force, and the destroyer Arashi takes after him. And he keeps going, and he leads a merry chase. And at some point, the captain of the Arashi says, you know, my job was to deal with the threat. I didn't destroy the American submarine, but I pushed him far enough away from the task force where he's not going to be a problem anymore. So the Arashi decides, now that we've pushed the submarine away, we need to turn around and we need to get back to the task force as quickly as possible. Which brings me to my third story. Again, Commander Wade Mac McCluskey. Now, these are the real heroes of Midway. I've already talked about Joseph Rochefort and how he was able to get the intelligence. McCluskey graduated from Annapolis in the early part of the century, and he was originally trained to be a dive bomber pilot, and he was very good at it. In fact, Admiral Spruance, who didn't give many compliments to anybody, said that he was a terrific commander. Well, he's out there on the Enterprise, and he gets the word that they need somebody to train as a dive bomber pilot. I'm sorry, I back up. He was trained as a fighter pilot. So they need somebody to train to be a commander of the commander of a dive bombing unit. So almost in a matter of days, McCluskey familiarizes himself with how you fly one of these Dauntless dive bombers. He was a very good pilot. However, it is another interesting fact that on the day of the Battle of Midway, and you're going to hear an amazing story in a minute, McCluskey had never dropped a bomb in his entire naval career. So like the air crews of the Hornet, he was pretty much of a rookie, at least in this department. But what he was not a rookie at was leadership and common sense. As I told you, any number of aircraft launched in anticipation of finding the Japanese before they know that we're out there. And we already talked about the torpedo planes. Well, the dive bombers were also out there. But when McCluskey arrived at the point where the Japanese fleet was supposed to be, they're not there. And they have about another 45 minutes to an hour of gasoline. Otherwise, they're not going to make it back to the Enterprise. So he had an incredibly difficult decision to make. One of the things that might have been the case was that the Japanese hadn't arrived at the point where they were supposed to be. So should we stay here and just circle and wait for them to appear? Or maybe they're behind me. Maybe I need to turn around and head back. Maybe I didn't, go in the right direction. Or maybe they changed direction. Now, think about this, and remember, you don't have a GPS. You don't have a lot of intel coming in. You have a plotting board in front of you, and you have to make a decision. And this is what I mean when we talk about instances like this. Every one of you in the Navy, whether you're a seaman right up to admiral, has an important job. And you may say, I'm just a little old petty officer, I'm just a little cog in this giant wheel. But remember, there are moments where you're going to make critical decisions. God forbid our country should ever have to go back to war on a major level like World War II. But it's a dangerous world. And if we do, you need to remember that your decisions and the analysis and the choices that you make have a profound effect. Now remember, McCluskey is certainly not a low-level petty officer, but at the same time, he's not somebody that's way up in Admiral Nimitz's office. He's out there at the point of attack. He made the decision to go a little bit longer, about another 30 miles. And he's still not seen the Japanese fleet, but he does see something. And this is another incredible story. He sees the wake of the Arashi. And he makes a determination. He says, that is a Japanese destroyer, and it is headed very, very quickly in that direction, and it can only be going one place. And he said, gentlemen, follow that destroyer. And in 10 minutes, the Japanese fleet came into view, And McCluskey's dive bombers were the very first ones. Commander Leslie also came from the other side, but by the time he arrived, McCluskey's boys were doing the job. And it really was a matter, again, of about 25 minutes, and the cream of the Japanese Navy is destroyed. So if you think about it, why were the dive bombers where they were? It wasn't because of pinpoint navigation or because of perfect intelligence. It was because of a decision that was made by this man at a critical, critical moment. And think what might have happened had he not made that decision. I mean, it's stunning, because if we don't get the 3 Japanese carriers in the early stages of the battle, as I told you before, they conquer over 1/7 of the Earth's surface. These were highly trained, just incredibly experienced and successful pilots. If they had been a football team, the Japanese would have been 16-0 and barely scored upon. So remember, when you're out there doing your job, it's not always just routine stuff. There are critical moments where you are going to be called upon to make decisions, and those decisions, no matter what level you're at, can have incredibly positive or negative consequences depending on what you do. So again, another amazing fact, and this is VF6. Another example of incredibly wise and prudent and critical decision making. And this is one of my favorite stories. Now, Admiral, I want to tell you right now before I present this story, this is not a plea. I'm not going to tell people that you shouldn't obey lawful orders, because you should. You can get in a lot of trouble if you don't. I know that from personal experience. But just kidding. But this is another gentleman, Lieutenant Commander DeWitt Shumway. At the time of the Battle of Midway, he was a lieutenant. And what had happened was the Yorktown had been attacked at 12 o'clock, in the 12 o'clock p.m. And she was burning. We're going to get back to the damage control in the Yorktown in a minute. But she could not launch or recover aircraft. And a lot of her aircraft had already taken off. And so what happened was, when the Yorktown was in bad shape and they weren't able to land their planes on the Yorktown, they had to go to another aircraft carrier. And they did. They went to the Enterprise. And Lieutenant Shumway was one of the members of that air group. And there was about 12 of them. Well, guess what? Around 4 p.m., they get word that they have located the 4th Japanese aircraft carrier, which was the Hiryu, Hiryu. They'd already gotten 3. And boy, would it be great if they could get the 4th. So here's what they've got. They've got 12 dive bombers from the Enterprise under the command of Lieutenant Gallagher, Wade Gallagher, and they've got 12 planes that are there from the Yorktown. And those 24 planes are going to be sent off the Enterprise without fighter cover, but it didn't really matter at that point because the Japanese were too busy. And they're going to go and attack the Hiryu. And if they can get that 4th carrier, it would be a stunning, stunning naval victory. But here's what happens. As they are heading toward the objective, and by the way, I'm going to be 63 years old in September, and one of my favorite bands when I was growing up was the Beach Boys. And the Beach Boys have a song called Be True to Your School. Well, Lieutenant Gallagher wanted to be true to his school, because as they start to head toward the Hiryu, remember, you got 12 people from the Enterprise, 12 people from the Yorktown who aren't normally on the ship. He also notices, Lieutenant Gallagher, that there is a Japanese battleship off to the right. And he says, okay, I want you guys, you 12 guys from the Yorktown, to take the battleship, and the 12 guys from the Enterprise, we're going to go and attack the Japanese aircraft carrier. And if you read the after-action reports, Lieutenant Shumway, after he received that order, got on the horn and said, do you think that you maybe should send a few more over to the aircraft carrier? And he said, you need to do what you were told to do. But here's what happens. And again, this is another amazing decision that was made. Lieutenant Shumway was on the extreme left of the group that was headed over here to attack the Japanese battleship. And he's looking out of the corner of his eye at the group from Enterprise that is attacking the Hiryu. And as a matter of fact, Lieutenant Gallagher was a brave man. He dove on the Hiryu, and he completely missed. And Shumway noticed that just about everybody from the Enterprise in their effort to attack the last Japanese carrier had missed as well. And he says to 4 or 5 of his fellow naval aviators, "Forget the battleship, come with me." Now, again, there's some debate about this, but we have a saying as historians, if it's not true, it ought to be. As Shumway and the unit, or the flyers from the unit of the Yorktown, as they head over, they attack the Hiryu, and he put a 500-pound bomb right in the middle of the rising sun on the deck of the Hiryu and blew it to smithereens, and a couple of the other guys from the Yorktown had major hits. So again, this is not an effort to make it okay to countermand lawful orders. But at the time, Shumway was told, you attack the battleship and we'll take care of the carrier. Like McCluskey, he understands very much that you've got to kind of be flexible. And when he realizes what the situation was, he made another critical decision. Because the Hiryu was getting ready, about ready to launch to, again, continue attacks against the American carriers. So, again, you've got 2 individuals, McCluskey and Shumway, who are at the point of the spear, who, if they had made different decisions or reacted differently, who knows how the battle would have come out. Another example. All right. And by the way, there should be, yes, there's Lieutenant Shumway. He looks rather dashing, doesn't he? All right, so, last amazing fact. When you're in the Navy, and I know this from personal experience, it can get very tiresome when you do drills, particularly safety drills. You do it again and again and again and again, and you're so tired of it, you're going to go crazy. You know, Chief, do we have to do this again? Yes, we have to do it again. Safety, 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 over and over and over and over. But there's a good reason for it, and we all know that. Because if you get really good at it and you're training it to the point where you don't have to think about it, when bad things happen, you're going to be able to do what you need to do. So this is an amazing story. Again, it's not that exciting, but it's so critical. There was a machinist mate on the Yorktown, and his name was Oscar Mayer, and he was not the heir to the hot dog empire. That was his real name. But he was involved, he was in charge of taking care of the aviation fuel on the Lexington. And as you all know, or maybe you don't know, the Lexington was attacked at Coral Sea, and she was sunk, and she caught fire, and they had a lot of trouble putting the fires out, and she had to be abandoned, and the Lexington was gone. But one of the things that he realized at Coral Sea was that the presence of aviation fuel in the lines throughout the ship was one of the reasons that the ship could not recover, despite the fact that they had, you know, damage control crews working overtime. So when the aircraft on the Yorktown at a critical moment took off, and there's no aircraft left, they're off to try to get the enemy, they have no fighter cover over them, they are basically sitting ducks. He says, I'm not going to let happen today what happened at the Coral Sea. Now this may seem very simple, but it had a profound effect. He ordered that all of the fuel be drained out of the lines, and he was able to put a layer of CO2 on top of the gasoline stocks. And guess what? About an hour later, the Yorktown, as I told you, at 12 p.m., was attacked, a vicious attack. And the ship was in very, very bad shape, but guess what? She was sunk 2 days later by a Japanese submarine. She survived the battle, and within a matter of hours, they were able to put out the fires, and they were able to get her underway. And if she hadn't been hit by that Japanese submarine's torpedo, she would have survived the battle. But Oscar Mayer learned very quickly little things that you can do, which turn out to have just amazing effects. And so the next time you're doing a drill, the next time you're involved in some type of safety exercise, just remember that there's a point to it. All right, so this is the tale of the tape. And this is why this battle matters. Carriers. The Yorktown was sunk again after the battle. We sunk 4. Heavy cruisers, we sunk 1 of Japan's. Destroyers, we lost 1. Aircraft, 332. And we lost 147 pilots. But this is the one that really matters. And by the way, when you are out there in the big wide world, and I would imagine almost everybody here has a top secret clearance, and somebody bothers you and says, what do you do? I really want to know what you do. And you're not going to be able to tell them. One of the things you can tell them is, actually you can tell them 2 things. Number 1, you help your country to achieve its goals. And number 2, you help to save lives. And if they say, well, what do you mean? You could say, well, let's talk about the Battle of Midway. The United States loses 307 people. And by the way, this figure needs to be adjusted up. Japan lost over 3,000 people. 3,000. So intelligence does not win battles. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines do. And we drive that point home at the museum every day. But they do help the commanders of those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to know what the next day, month, or year is going to bring. And like McCluskey and like Lieutenant Shumway, they can make wise, prudent decisions based on that intelligence. But also, if they act on that intelligence, it is likely that more of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines under their command are going to be able to go home to their families. So intelligence done right not only helps you to win, but it helps you to save lives. So I want to end with one more interesting story. And again, we just had Memorial Day. But you see here Admiral Ingersoll, who was in charge of the Atlantic Fleet, and his son, William Ingersoll Jr. And the Hornet had a very bad day, and I'm going to conclude the briefing by talking about this. Hornet had experienced a tragic, frustrating day. She had lost all of her torpedo bombers, her dive bombers had missed the action, and her fighters had ditched for lack of fuel. Now, in playing Good Samaritan to refugees from Yorktown, she took another blow. A wounded pilot crash-landed his aircraft without cutting off the machine guns. As the fighter struck the deck, the impact sprayed slugs toward the island, penetrating 1-inch hardened plate and a steel I-beam. The shots killed 5 men and wounded 20 others. Among the dead was the brilliant, promising Lieutenant Royal R. Ingersoll II, son of the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. Admiral Ingersoll was a giant of a man, although not in physical stature, always putting what was best for the Navy ahead of personal feeling or desire that he may have had. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, an associate overheard Ingersoll telling his son that now that war had been declared, no regular officer could possibly consider a shore assignment. He must ask for a job at sea. So when his son's death struck with a special impact, in public, Ingersoll took the blow stoically. But late one night, when only he and his associate were in the office, he informed his friend how torn up inside he had been when his advice to his son had led to his death. The victory at Midway did not come cheaply to the high or to the low. So I want to salute each and every one of you today because it is a fact, and to me it is a sad fact, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. Less than 1% of the American public is in uniform or knows what it's like to serve in the military. And so you guys are special. You really are. I mean, I take great pride. I'm not much of a Navy veteran, but I am one. And it's one of the really things that I'm most proud of in my life because you are involved in a critical, critical mission. And here's the sad part about it. All the people out there in the big wide world, the American public, they really don't know what you go through and they don't know what your challenges are because most of them have never, ever faced or dealt with what you have to deal with. So again, I want to thank you for coming here today. And I want to salute you for your service and your sacrifice. And with that, I am now open, if any, for questions. Now, I have to tell you, if I have to go back to Fort Meade and I don't get one question, I'm going to feel like an abject failure. And you don't want Mr. Weadon to feel bad today, do you? There's got to be at least one question out there. Now, this is a bright, erudite group. Somebody saved me. Aha, very good. The check's in the mail.
Chief Peters, Kennedy Irregular Warfare Center. I'll do you one better. I got a ghost story about Yorktown from that.
Please, share.
After Yorktown had been hit by the dive bombers, but as she's listing and they're basically doing damage control efforts, in aft engineering, a group of machinist mates were caught behind watertight doors. They managed to have sound-powered telephones, and they're talking to DC Central the whole time. They're giving them pep talks. We'll have guys down there in an hour. Hey, if they didn't come through, we'll have them down there in a few hours. And they're saying, no problem, we got it. Well, when she got torpedoed and they decided to abandon ship, they told them, guys, we're not coming for you. And apparently the last words were, hey, it's no big deal. We've got a great game of gin rummy going down here. Flash forward, they had commissioned the next USS Yorktown, an Essex-class carrier in the war. And guys said late at night, down in the equivalent space in engineering, you could hear a gin rummy game going. Nobody's down there. And they said that there was another Yorktown, and even the cruiser, the equivalent space, you could hear it.
Very good. Now, you can give the briefing next year, because I didn't know that. That was very good. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Sir, did we ever break the revised code, Japanese code?
Yes. Oh, JN25B. We broke it in May of 1942. Again, there are a lot of people who will tell you that Franklin Roosevelt knew about Pearl Harbor, and when you ask them why they would ever say such a silly thing, they'll say, well, you know, we broke Japan's naval codes prior to Pearl Harbor. No, we did not. We broke two very important Japanese diplomatic codes, and we assumed when we broke the diplomatic codes that we would be able to know what the Japanese were going to do from a tactical perspective. But guess what? The leaders of the Japanese military did not trust the diplomats. They had too much contact with Westerners, so they didn't tell them anything. So the next time you run into some screwy conspiracy theorist, and he tells you that Roosevelt knew about Pearl Harbor because we'd broken Japan's codes, we don't break Japan's naval code until mid-May of 1942. And again, we do it just in time for the Battle of Midway, and as I noted at the very beginning of this briefing, during the Battle of Midway, because they changed the additive tables, we were actually in the dark. Other questions? Okay, yes?
Yes, sir. After the change in the additive tables, were we able to then break the code?
Yes, because what's happening, it's like, now I'm going to date myself here because you guys are, most of you